We are going to need a party that will organize working people to fight for the demands that we want and to win socialism. Thank you so much.
Quick point of privilege. Quick point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Guys, first of all, James Jackson, Sacramento, he, him. I just want to say, can we please keep the chatter to a minimum? I'm one of the people who's very, very prone to sensory overload. There's a lot of whispering and chatter going on. It's making it very difficult for me to focus. Please, can we just, I know we're all fresh and ready to go, but can we please just keep the chatter to a minimum? It's affecting my ability to focus. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, is there a speaker against name, chapter, pronoun?
Point of personal privilege.
Yes.
Please do not use gendered language to address everyone.
So in the week since I've recorded my video on democracy, there have been a number of people asking for points of clarification. Since the video on democracy was based around models and idealized forms of how democracy might work, this is very understandable. We don't have a lot of substantive examples, just allusions to historical records and events that happened 100 or 1,000 years ago. It's more or less not surprising that defenders of democracy are going to find a model I just cooked up to represent how democracy should work to be rather unconvincing. Strangely enough, very few of the people who defended the concept of democracy in the comment section of the last video really were defending the way democracy works in our present order, inside a Republican form of government. There seem to be a lot of people willing to defend democracy, but very few people willing to defend Congress. I guess that's not surprising. But among the people who do defend democracy, both in my comments and on Twitter, I've noticed a lot of people pointing away from representative forms of democracy and towards direct democracy, where direct decision-making and direct organizational decisions about government are pushed to the people themselves, presumably in large assemblies. To be quite honest, I never found this call for direct democracy to be very convincing, least of all by the people who constantly seem to make it. Living for about a year inside a student housing co-op in grad school, a student housing co-op that determined a fair amount of the house funds through direct democratic voting, I had a very poor experience with this form of decision-making, and so have most people who experience this way of handling decisions. Probably this is the reason why most self-professed socialists and direct Democrats don't choose to live in these types of arrangements themselves. It never works out very well. Nevertheless, this hasn't stopped the myth or ideal of direct democracy to spread far and wide, especially inside far-left circles. Sure, democracy might not work as well as advertised, but that's just because it's not direct enough. Well, perhaps. But luckily for myself, and really everyone who debates against democratic socialists, we were treated to a prime example of direct democracy in action at this week's Democratic Socialists of America convention. Now, most people will have already heard about the Democratic Socialists of America convention due to a few particularly noteworthy cringe quotes coming around and circulating about on right-wing Twitter. The clips displaying what apparently looks like a never-ending freakout over gender pronouns and disability awareness make the delegates look like a bunch of sheltered children who can't tell their heads from their back ends. Still, as with most things on right-wing Twitter, I think that these initial cringe compilations and laughing at progressives and liberals' incompetence and them being snowflakes misses the true force, the true teachable moment that is contained inside the footage of the Democratic Socialists of America convention. Although it's tempting to think of all of these progressives and socialists as incompetent narcissists who can't get out of their own way, and while that may be true or not true, the real teachable moment from this entire interaction is about democracy and the incentives that are present in democracy. So for those who thought I was too abstract in my last video about democracy, I think a useful exercise is to observe how the Democratic Socialists of America make a critical decision about leadership in this context. What are the bounds of power? What are the constraints on power? And how are the incentives created by those bounds playing out in each of the members' interactions with each other? So to make this point, I'm going to play through part of the recording of the DSA, looking at a portion that really wasn't encapsulated in many memes, but nevertheless demonstrates how this organization makes decisions, starting with when they begin voting on a key set of rules that's going to govern the convention and their organization going forward.
Everyone, we're going to start voting, so let's take a deep breath. Great. And so I'm going to welcome Brian to give the credentials report.
Now, I should say here that the DSA is voting on some set of bylaws that are going to be passed into the main body of their own rules. It's not very easy to see from context what exactly this implies, but nevertheless, they begin voting and then immediately go into a speaker who delivers some kind of dry overview as to what the rules are and what the proposed changes might be, which we see in the next few seconds of dialogue.
So, I will begin reading the summary. In the complete report...
Point of personal privilege. There are people at the back who are having problems hearing.
Oh.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much.
So I'm pausing the video here for a comment. Now, I know this particular clip has been taken out of context in a variety of the memes and little clips that were circulating on Twitter. In reality, the quote-unquote point of privilege that is being brought up here is a legitimate one. Apparently, people can't actually hear the presenter. This is a common reason to tap a presenter on the shoulder and get them to adjust their mic. Nevertheless, there seem to be a number of things that are kind of wrong or weird going on here. First, we can take a look at the environment. This is a fairly large convention hall. It is a large group of people. Over Dunbar's number, it appears to be over 200 people who are listening to this presentation. Yet, there doesn't seem to be any focus or attention given to the speakers. People are milling about and doing their own business. It's hard to get the sense that any of the people listening to this presentation are particularly invested in what the person says. Now, of course, maybe the presentation is more or less redundant. It's things we already know, like a safety demonstration before an airplane takes off. Most people don't pay attention because it's always the same and we've heard it 1,000 times. Although a lot of the things you hear from the audience just don't seem to indicate that this is the case. Now, even before the camera rolls on and confirms this suspicion, you can get the very, very clear impression that people aren't not paying attention because they've heard this all before. They're not paying attention because this is all complicated and no one expects them to actually understand it or know it before they cast their votes. Moreover, this impression is confirmed by the interruption on point of privilege. Legitimate or not, whether you want to tap someone on the shoulder and tell them that their microphone is down too low, the mere fact that this has to be done through a flat-out interruption, a call-out in the middle of a crowded room, indicates that things aren't organized well enough for objections to be brought up to the speaker before they have to be realized and shouted out by the audience. Something with the decision-making process is fundamentally disorganized. But I think more becomes clear when a counter-proposal is put on the floor, and we see how this democratic system works in action.
Hi, I motion to amend the report to strike the East Bay Local's winning slate 6 lowest-ranking delegates, who are Shane R., Emma G., Andrew R., Max L., Richard M., and Charlie H., from the list of delegates from the East Bay Local of DSA, and that top vote receiving alternates, including Bonnie L., Colin PBM, Dan E., Ted F., Colin M., and Jackie A. be added to that list.
Now, immediately following this introduction, we get a very substantive counter-proposal. One person, one party wants to replace delegates, one set of delegates with another set of delegates. This is a very important move inside a democratic process of decision-making. Once delegates move around, once committees reshape their form, power necessarily shifts. It's these kind of procedural moves that cause gerrymandering, that cause lobbying, that cause committee favoritism, the very kind of boogeymen that Democrats and democratic socialists constantly complain actively subvert democracy and have to be left up to the people to decide and correct in order for any democratic process to be legitimate. Therefore, this decision up and down whether to replace these delegates is of utmost importance, and it is of utmost importance that the people who are invested in this community make a very good decision and one that everyone understands and also sees as completely transparent and just. So how is this handled?
There's a motion to amend the roster to substitute 6 members of the... Yes.
So point of clarification in that the chair gave a report. There was a verbal second from the audience on the report of which was given, and then there was a motion for an amendment to that. What are we actually talking about at this point, and then what is the vote going to be?
Thank you.
We need to be very clear about the work that we are trying to do. It is important.
Well, there's our first indication. The first question being asked, what are we actually voting on? And the crowd almost breaks into applause before they remember that applause isn't allowed because this is the DSA and everyone has to do jazz hands. It's apparent in this minute that no one really knows what they're voting on or even what context the votes are being counted in. They're just along for the ride.
So right now, we are debating the amendment to the committee report, and that amendment is to swap six of the the amendment is to take six.
I had to pause it here because at this moment, watching this, I realized that not only does the audience not really understand what they're voting on, but even the speakers and the moderators don't really understand the propositions in their entirety. The moderator in question here having to check her notes furiously before even completing an explanation over what vote was currently being brought to the floor.
Different delegates to recognize 6 different delegates from East Bay from what the committee report says.
So in voting yes, are we voting to
Yes. Yeah, so voting yes
uphold
means
the delegates?
No.
More confusion abounds. Does anyone know what's going on right now?
So voting yes means that you want the substitute 6 delegates to be seated instead of the delegation that is outlined in the Credentials Committee report.
Thank you.
Does that make sense? No.
Okay, now they're just trying to be silly. After hearing 3 explanations of this motion, I feel like I understand what's being discussed, and I haven't even been at this convention. But wait, there are more questions still on the floor.
Yes. Could you get to the mic, please?
Just to be clear, the amendment is going against basically the spirit of the report that was just delivered,
correct.
right? So if you agree with what the report recommended, then you should. I'm just asking. I'm trying to understand what.
Now, although this clip is fairly long, I included it for a very particular reason. Here we see someone asking another point of clarification, but this time, for some reason, even though his question is more legitimate and more to the point than half a dozen others that have come up previously, you catch this sudden wave of disapprobation, a feeling of anger, even in an audience that can't express anger through any outward means of sound. There suddenly seems to be this hostility, to the point where the speaker has to retract into a defensive posture. And I think that this is entirely interesting. Part of it might be that people are frustrated that the vote's taking so long to actually come to a head, but another part might be that there's just a certain group expectation that we all vote in a certain way, and the speaker's own question indicated a disbelief in some preconception we were expected to bring to this specific vote. At any rate, although clarification is offered, the questions aren't completely over.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so now is there any further debate on the Credentials Committee report?
Point.
Hold on. Point of order. Yep.
Thank you. So.
Sorry, what's your name and
my name is Trey. I use they, them, and he, him pronouns. I'm from Memphis. Thank you for asking. Nice to meet you. Sorry.
Nice to meet you.
I had a question. So. Nick? Jack? What is his name? Or what is their name? Nick J. They were elected as an at-large delegate before they resigned. Is that correct? No? Okay, then.
Now, I just included this clip because I thought it was hilarious. The vote's almost about to be brought to the floor for actual ballot casting when we get another question that, in addition to apparently being totally uninformed about who's elected and who's not and who's standing and who's not, also seems to be more interested in connecting and making friendships, mind you, in front of an audience of almost 1,000 people. than it does in actually moving a conversation or a debate forward. You can see a sort of pain in the speaker's eyes, and what's so funny about it is this is the debate portion of the argument, but at no point was anything ever really debated on its merits. We spent all of this time just clarifying what the vote was eventually going to be on. In order to get to a debate on the merits, we'd have to spend additional time and ask additional questions on top of it in front of the same enormous audience. Now, when I bring this up as sort of objections generally to how a process like this might work, defense naturally is going to be, well, you're hearing questions from the minority of the audience that is uninformed. Most people know what's going on. Most people know the process. Most people know the people who are standing for election and people who have been elected and the terms of the debate itself. While this certainly is an important issue, most people are informed, and it might not be a particularly controversial one. Once the people who haven't been paying attention or were absent for the explanation are caught up to speed, there's not going to be any real open questions that need to be answered before anyone can reasonably cast their ballot. Everyone in the know, including the speaker and the people actually bringing the motion to the floor, know what they're doing, and they know the right way to vote. We might believe this if it wasn't for the next question.
Now, we are going to...
Point of information, could you please let us know how many delegates there are?
Anyone know that? Hold on 1 second. Do you know that?
I believe 1,057.
So apparently nobody knows what's going on. The most important question in democracy: how many people are actually voting on this decision? How many people are representing people in this voting decision? How are the dynamics of popular votes working? The question is asked, and nobody in the entire room, including the speaker and the other experts presumably leading the vote, can answer it. The best we get is an interjection from an audience member with an approximate number of delegates. No one has the slightest idea what they're doing. And to add insult to injury, the reaction to this very pertinent question, this revelation of ultimate ignorance about the very process you're leading and participating, is it greeted with genuine questioning of the authority system in place? No, it's greeted with laughter. Because nobody is taking this seriously. No one feels like it should be taken seriously, when in reality, this should be very serious. They're organizing delegates. They're organizing votes. They are, from the perspective of someone who believes in democracy, managing how people's voices actually come to bear when it comes to decisions of power. If we're dealing with real power and real consequences, how could this not be incredibly important? Yet at the same time, the leaders, the delegates, just laugh it off. I mean, who cares? All it is voting, right? It doesn't really have any consequences or mean anything. We're all just here doing something, doing kind of a democracy thing, but there's no consequences. We don't really care about the results. We don't even really know what we're doing or the rules or the number of delegates. It's just a performance. It's just a show. It's performative democracy. That's the only way to explain this. Imagine if this was something we actually did care about. Suppose you asked your boss, hey, I didn't get my paycheck this month. What happened to it? And your boss just shrugged his shoulders and went, well, maybe I forgot to make payroll this month. Who cares? No one would tolerate this, and when real power is at stake, no one does tolerate it. So by conclusion, we can only assume that what we're seeing here is just entertainment. It's just a game. It's fun. It's all for a good laugh. But if we had serious skin in the game, if we stood to lose our actual wealth or homes or have our businesses taken away from us, as we must imagine we will in a situation where the DSA is redistributing wealth, this would become a lot less fun and a lot less funny. It's only a game because the delegates in question here have nothing to lose, which is not the case in real government. What we have just witnessed is an organization of about 1,000 people who firmly believe in this process, participating in a 20-minute discussion where everyone was more aware of their microaggressions and triggers than they were anything about the actual system in which they participated. They didn't know who was standing. They didn't know what was being brought to a vote. They didn't even know how many delegates were there. This is truly an astonishing situation. But instead of pointing and laughing and making jokes about progressives that make ourselves feel smart and make them look dumb, have we asked ourselves the truly interesting question? How can we explain this? Why has this happened? Why has this ridiculous contradiction come into existence? And why do people still believe this will work? Once again, I think the tempting answer to this question is that progressives or socialists, or whatever these people identify as, are just incompetent snowflakes. They have no real fortitude, they don't have a grip, and they can't make any decisive decisions outside of a support group. This is an easy way to dismiss the problem, but I think it's not really what's going on here. I would maintain that even if you took a bunch of steel-jawed, razor-sharp reactionaries from the military and put them in this kind of situation, they may well devolve over time to some form of this process. It's how the thing is set up that's causing the problem. The issue, in a word, is information. After the number of people in any organization grows, and especially as it grows above Dunbar's number at around 150, the complexity of that system increases exponentially. There is simply no way to know everyone and understand everyone's desires at any kind of intimate level. There's also an increasing need of various rules and regulations to keep that many voices in order. So, a very, very complex set of bylaws is almost always necessary. And of course, unless every one of the delegates is firmly aware of those bylaws, and more importantly how those bylaws may be used and abused, they are functionally not really participating in that democratic process in any meaningful and conscious way. They're simply in autopilot, ready to be influenced by any single persuasion that might come their way. They don't understand the real levers of power involved in the situation. Most people involved with these systems in a casual fashion, or even in a professional fashion, don't really want to know all of the ins and outs. They don't feel like they want to put the investment into the system to understand how it can be gamed, or how games can be prevented. In a word, this has something to do with self-interest. Regardless of if you know how the rules work, it's really questionable if you can or even should use that knowledge to get more power. After all, everyone's supposed to be equal, and wouldn't it be illegitimate for more informed people to vote with more power than the uninformed? That's never clear. But even beyond complexity, there are additional problems that the information limitations pose when communities of democracy grow beyond 100 or 200 people. And another one of these complicating features is the problem of disagreement and controversy. As the issues become more complex, as they necessarily have to with more people, the vectors for disagreement will multiply. If there were actual genuine debates over interest on any given issue at a time, people would be there for hours, even after every one of the 1,000 delegates figured out what the actual thing they were voting on was. Any real political issue where actual power is being moved is going to have any number of different dimensions where it intersects with various different groups and individual interests, and each one of them is going to want to have their say and petition the collective for why their concerns should be taken more seriously. If this is taken to its logical conclusion under democracy, people would be there for hours, dealing with every possible combination of interests that are being decided in between. Certainly, this cannot go on, and as such, democracies such as this have to operate under the illusion of consensus, the belief that democracy is going on and everyone agrees with each other, which certainly can't be the case if there is something real at stake and everyone gets a voice. Luckily enough, or unluckily, depending on your point of view, usually systems like this have groups, coalitions that keep order. There are reigning cliques of people who make sure that everyone votes in a way that maintains the illusion of the consensus. In some sense, this is like a Ouija board, but there's also a certain amount of planning that goes in it. When you're in a democratic community like this, voting on a particular issue of import, it becomes very clear after a while which people pull the weight, which people others look to vote in turn. Inevitably, people in this position want to present the winning side of any argument as a political consensus, and in most cases are willing to enforce this, sometimes quite vindictively. Therefore, if you're the average run-of-the-mill voter, it behooves you to understand who the real important coalitions of power are, what they value, what they think is legitimate, and vote along with them, lest you later on become the target of their machinations. Although it sounds rather contradictory and certainly clangs in the ear of most leftists, the last thing you want to be in one of these democratic processes is a naysayer or a troublemaker. Believe me, once meetings stretch on to 2 or 3 hours, and people are looking for reasons why they still have to be there and cast a vote, the reigning consensus will have no trouble blaming the lack of expedient democratic decision-making on the people that they don't like. And you don't want to be one of those people. At the same time, the surest way to get special attention, the surest way to get special dispensation and more power, is to appear to one of these consensus makers as particularly needing or particularly deserving of some type of reward or consideration. As we discussed in the initial video, empathy always needs to be taken into account in small democratic systems, and being perceived as having special needs is a sure way to getting a democratic system to give you consideration well in excess of your particular number. But where in a small group there are likely to be very few people asking for special considerations, these types of considerations grow exponentially as the group does, and inevitably, decision-making has to be made over which considerations need to have priority. Enter the role of the reigning cultural consensus. A cultural consensus that is oftentimes developed by a small coterie of people inside the larger democratic group, ones that are unelected but just influential. And thus we see between these 2 points that real power and real consideration inside this system is not really developed by knowledge of how the system works or participation in the community in a productive way. It's not developed by solving problems or ensuring that the interests of the group as a whole are advanced. Rather, it's by influencing a small group of people, either to consider you a troublemaker or to consider you someone who needs special attention, reward, or consideration because of their considered needs. These roles are determined, and then the consensus is naturally turned to delivering rewards and punishments to people who occupy those roles. I think this, more than anything else, explains every element of how we see the DSA delegates performing in this particular video. There is a distinct care given towards people who might be seen as vulnerable, at least by the ruling clique or coterie that determines what the cultural consensus of need is. Secondly, there is disapprobation shown towards some questions that seem like they're outside of the consensus, while really a manifest lack of knowledge to any procedural development or procedural reality of how the system works. To us, it looks like kabuki theater, because to a large degree, it is kabuki theater. The main goal of everyone in attendance is to show that they are part of the consensus, that they aren't a troublemaker, and also to show that they're one of the people that needs special consideration, more privileges, more attention. Therefore, the interruptions, the points of privilege that everyone is mocking, are actually a real faucet of power transfer inside this group. They are grasping for the coveted positions inside their form of egalitarian government, which are not necessarily elected positions, but are roles that the reigning, undeclared, unelected coterie has already determined as being particularly needing or deserving of more resources, consideration, and voice time. Snowflakes or not, mature or not, the behavior of these delegates has less to do with any personality traits they may or may not possess, and more to do with the real incentives that are put in place by this type of system. It's one that privileges a certain kind of emotional communication, and disprivileges knowledge and dissent. And it is, after everything is said and done, after all of the necessary complications are sorted out, after we filter through all of the word games and emotional doublespeak, it is non-democratic. After everything is said and done, a small aristocracy rules. They set the bounds of the conversation. They set the mode of the consensus that inevitably wins the dialectic before any debate is really had. And regardless of who knows how many delegates are even in existence or where, the conclusions are already determined. They are already known and developed by people who understand how the system works and the decisions it must eventually come to. Man's best attempt to achieve democracy always ends, as the iron law predicts, with more oligarchy, with new bosses, just under slightly different terms. Slightly different, more obscured terms. And here, as always, lies the problem. Now, as one final objection before I close this video, people might be wondering, well, if you're not particularly fond of democracy, why do you care that it's ultimately self-defeating? Why do you care that the iron law of oligarchy has taken us from a distributed democratic system back to an aristocratic system, if you yourself believe everything is fundamentally oligarchy? Well, in part, my serious criticism with how this group functions is that the people who own the power and who wield the power wield it in secret and do not truly own the consequences of their decisions. There are no clear rules in place, or no clear rules that anyone really respects, and the true way of distributing power and taking responsibility for that power exist behind the scenes. No one can see how they're actually being used, or whether they're being used to make quite serious mistakes. Therefore, the natural human ability to correct ourselves when we see that we are wrong is hampered. We cannot learn from our mistakes because our mistakes are always being attributed to a vague democratic entity that doesn't really exist. At the end of this entire process, I'm not so much an anti-democrat than I am a formalist. I am a person who believes in order. I want there to be clear rules. I want the people who wield the power to be known as the people who wield the power. So when they finally make the mistakes, they can be recognized for the mistakes that they made, so that others can learn. Now, I'll end this video directed mainly at progressives here. But before I close, there's one further message I'd like to leave to people who are more on the conservative, traditionalist, post-liberal, or reactionary side of things. And the message is simply this: do not underestimate these people. While they look stupid, while they look like they're emotionally stunted and can't get anything done, nothing could be further from the case. When these people have serious setbacks, when they come to the reality and the limitations of what they're trying to do, this movement will erupt in rage, and they will find competent leaders to carry out vengeance upon the people that they think are responsible for their dream not working. If we underestimate this, it could be a fatal mistake. What starts as a snowflake eventually becomes a blizzard. And so for people who watch these videos, trying to feel some comfort about the incompetence of their enemies, I'd urge each one of us to see themselves less like people consuming entertainment and more people who are trying to learn from their environment. We are people trying to predict the weather and prepare for it in advance of a happening. Rather than comedic entertainment, these are all prefigurings of what will come in the future, and woe to he who cannot read the signs of the times.